Skepticism about the Bible is a hallmark of our present society, especially among, the leftists, the liberal elites who seem to control our society, especially so much in the media and what comes out of the media. This week, true to form, the people who are running our media decided to take the opportunity to continue their long campaign against everything they do against the Bible, to try to discredit, to try to show that it's not historic, or it doesn't have historicity, or is not accurate, that it is, especially that it is not the divine inspired revelation of the truth. This week on Thursday, a just completed study of ancient Canaanite DNA was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, a prestigious publication indeed. Now, the spin that was placed on this article, this study that was published, and it's a study about 5 ancient DNA samples taken from archaeologically excavated remains of Canaanite people, who the archaeologists estimated had lived about 3,750 years to 3,650 years ago. And this study, which was authored by Chris Tyler Smith, a geneticist who studies human evolution at the Sanger Institute in Britain, he put out, or perhaps it was the editor of the journal, they put out in their headline, they said, a new study rules out the biblical idea that an ancient war wiped out the Canaanites. Instead, it shows the Canaanites left a long line of descendants. This was the message that they had bolded and put into the subhead so everyone could see and prominently perceive that this highly respected journal was, they were doing their part in this media campaign that's been long waged against the historicity of the Bible. Unfortunately, for the people at the American Journal of Human Genetics and Chris Tyler Smith of the Sanger Institute in Britain, what they put out is genuinely, at least the implications of it, is genuinely fake news. And I want you to know that. I want you to understand that. Now, Tyler Smith said in his study, I suppose he was just the leader of this, and there was a whole team of geneticists that was working on this. Tyler Smith said that their study proves the ancient Canaanite DNA, when compared to the modern-day people that are living at this point in time in the Middle East, it shows that the Canaanites have managed to leave a long line of descendants. The Sanger Institute geneticists sequenced the Canaanite genome and compared it to the genomes of modern people, including Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and others from around the world. And the comparison revealed, listen to this, revealed that 90% of the genetic ancestry of the people of Lebanon, north of Israel, came from the Canaanites. Curiously, the other 10% of the genetic background of the people up in Lebanon happened to seems to pertain to some sort of Eurasian steppe population. Very curious about that. Those of you who've read some of what I've had to say before will know what I'm driving at there. We can say that the Lebanese mostly descend from an ancestry that is found in those 5 individuals, said Mark Haber, who is one of the Sanger Institute geneticists. Okay, and he mentioned that what we find is that ancestry, the ancestry has changed, but it has changed very little. Oh, you mean of those people living in Lebanon, you know, really, they are, for the most part, Canaanites. Yeah, and then they're just like their ancestors 3,750 years or 3,650 years ago, back to the Middle Bronze Age. Wow. Well, anyways, from this standpoint, you know, that they say this: the unbroken genetic heritage was a surprise to those researchers. From the Bronze Age origin, from the Bronze Age onward, the coastal Mediterranean region has been the site of repeated conquering and reshuffling of populations. There was more genetic continuity in Lebanon, they said, than in a place like England. Oh. Well, yes. When you study the history of things, this is hardly surprising. Yes, the genetics in England have changed over the years. Absolutely. And you know, you study history, you'll understand that. But the fact that the population of Lebanon is, for the most part, Canaanite, well, why should that surprise us? Are the Persians still Persians? Are the Arabs of Saudi Arabia, you know, still Ishmaelites? You know, I mean, why are we surprised by this? Yes, the author of this report argues that even if the Canaanites suffered some defeats anciently, enough people survived that they contributed to the present-day population. So this is the conclusion they see from this. They say, so the Bible's scientifically wrong, they say, and they make this point because Tyler Smith argues that while the Hebrew text commanded the Canaanites in the Promised Land to be annihilated, the research shows, you know, the facts came out otherwise. And they quote this. Okay, Tyler Smith quotes in their article, they quote Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16 to 18 in support of their conclusion that the Bible is scientifically disproved. All right, let's take a look. Let's take a look at what the story really is and what does the evidence really prove. It might turn out to be the exact opposite of what they assume it says. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16, and I'm going to read this in the Holman Christian Standard Bible. However, you must not let any living thing survive among the cities of these people the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Okay, talking about them going into the Promised Land. This is the revelation that God had given to Moses. He said, verse 17, you must completely destroy them. The Hittite, the Amorite, Canaanite, Perizzite, Hivite, and Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they won't teach you to do all the detestable things that they do for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. God did not believe in religious diversity from this standpoint, did he? He was very politically incorrect. So let's take a moment to unpack some of the logic of these geneticists in this published, you know, in this distinguished journal. And, you know, and let's take a look at what the Canaanite DNA survival really means. Now, chronologically, according to the archaeologists who discovered the graves from which they took the samples, and I believe the samples they took were just right behind the ear. It turns out that the bone here is very, very dense, and it acts sort of like almost like a bank vault. You know, it keeps DNA. But anyways, the 5 ancient Canaanite sample guinea pigs, okay, the graves, the skeletons they used, that the Sanger Institute people used. Now, these people, these Canaanites, according to their own estimate, lived 200 to 300 years before the Israelites under Joshua crossed over the Jordan River to wrest their promised land out of the hands of the Canaanites and their allies. And you know, all the other people who lived there, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, all the ites. The internal chronology of the Bible places the Israelite invasion, according to what the Bible indicates, about 1,447 years ago, 1447 BC. That's according to Carl Franklin's 2007 research, which is actually used in the Coulter Bible. Or it might be 1452, according to a literal reading of the Bible that used by James Ussher, who was a 16th century Archbishop of Armagh for the Protestant Church of Ireland. Or it might be 1471, according to the 4th century church historian Eusebius. Okay, but it's all, they're all pegging it within about 20 years. You get the point. This means that those 5 ancient Canaanites who formed the basis for this genetic study of ancient Canaanite DNA lived, if I want to give it a modern day comparison, about the same amount of time as our day right now, from George Washington's day and the American Revolution. That, or if you want to put it from the British Commonwealth standpoint, the first British-American Civil War. From this standpoint, we're about a bit more than 200 years ago. 1776 is, we're in this area. So what does the Bible fully say about the fate of the Canaanites? Should it surprise us that we see a large representation still in the original homelands of descendants of the Canaanites living there? Is that a surprise to us? Seems to have been a surprise to the authors of this report. But let's take a look. Let's open up our Bibles here. First of all, let's go in the book of Joshua. Let's go to the book of Joshua. And we're going to read here in Joshua chapter 16. You're going to be right after the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Joshua, and we'll go Joshua chapter 6 and verse 16. And it came to pass at the 7th time, when the people blew the ram's horn, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you city, and the city shall be devoted to the Lord, it and all that is in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all her that are in her house, because she hid the messengers we sent." So you're going to have some genetic survival right there in Rahab the harlot. "And you shall surely keep clear of the cursed thing, lest you make yourselves cursed when you take of the cursed things," because everything that was supposed to be devoted either is going to be reused and remelted down if it was a metal, or it was going to be burnt. Said, "All the silver and all the gold and the vessels of bronze and iron are devoted to the Lord, and they shall come into the treasury of the Lord." And the people shouted when the priests blew the horn. And it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the ram's horns, and the people shouted, and the great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, each man straight before him, and they took the city. I've said before that I've been to Jericho, and I've seen the walls that fell down, and they fell down on the glacis, and the people could walk straight up over it. That's the way it was. And of course, there was one section of the wall that did not fall down, because of course, Rahab's house was built on the wall. Anyways, verse 21, "And they completely destroyed all the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword." Yeah, they did. They killed everything. But what you see here, let's go to Joshua 7, verse 1. You see here all of a sudden that the people who did this, you had a fellow who, he coveted some of the things of the Canaanites. He didn't do what he was told, and his family went along with him. And it created a major problem. And you have the whole story of this city called Ai. That's just Ai, that's the way we pronounce it, where instead of, when they came up to this, they thought it was a small place, it'd be easy, they could knock it off, the Israelites could knock it off and wipe everybody out easily. Didn't work out that way. Instead they ran. And they discovered that somebody, they were discovered, let's go to, somebody had done something that is wrong. Verse 11 here, chapter 7 and verse 11. Because they were wondering, and God finally told them, it says, "Israel has sinned, and they have also broken my covenant which I commanded them, and have even taken of the cursed things." Something connected with the Canaanites, and probably their Canaanite religion. "And have also stolen and pretended falsely, and they have even put it among their own things. Therefore the children of Israel could not stand before the enemies, and they will turn their backs before their enemies, because they have become cursed. And I will not be with you unless you destroy the one who is cursed from among you." So you see here very clearly, and if you read the rest of the account here in this chapter, they went through that process and did that. Now, and they did destroy the rest. If you continued on, they wiped out everything that was in Ai. So they destroyed Jericho, killed all the people, all the Canaanites there. They destroyed Ai. They killed all the people there. Then all of a sudden we come to chapter 9. The Israelites were feeling their success. In chapter 9 and verse 1, we see this. We have the account in the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 9, verse 1. And it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the valleys and in all the coast of the great sea over against Lebanon, heard of it, heard of the successes that the Israelites were having and the destruction that they were wresting upon the population. The Hivite and the Amorites and the Canaanite and the Perizzites and the Hivite and the Jebusite, they all with one mind gathered themselves to fight with Joshua and with Israel. And when those who lived in Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they worked slyly. For they came and acted as if they were ambassadors and took old sacks upon their donkeys and old and torn and bound up wineskins and old and parched sandals upon their feet and old clothes upon them. And all the bread that they had taken was dry and moldy. And they came to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, which is right by the Jordan River. And they said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a far country. Now therefore make a treaty with us. And the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you are living among us. So how can we make a treaty with you? Because they had that command in Deuteronomy. And they said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, where are you and from where do you come? And they said to him, your servants have come from a very far country, because the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard of his fame and all the things he did in Egypt. Yeah, they had heard all about the story. See? They knew the stories. And all he had done to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond Jordan, to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and to Og, the king of Bashan, this area that is now part of Jordan, who was at Ashtaroth. And our elders and all those who live in our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions with you for the journey, and go to meet them. Say to them, we are your servants. Therefore now make a treaty with us. We took this bread hot for our provisions out of our houses on that day. We came out to meet you. But now, see, it is dry and it is moldy. And these wineskins which we filled were new. And see, they are torn. And these clothes and shoes of ours have become old because of a very long journey. Okay, they BS them in royal form. But look at this. In verse 14, and they received the men because of their provisions and did not ask of the mouth of the Lord. And Joshua made peace with them. He made a peace treaty and made a treaty with them and let them live. And the rulers of the congregation swore to them. And it came to pass at the end of the 3 days, when they had made the treaty with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. And the children of Israel journeyed and came to the cities on the 3rd day, and the cities were Gibeon, and he mentions a couple of the other ones. You know, it's a little kingdom. And the children of Israel did not strike them, because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. See, they had, in God's name, made a treaty with them. And all the congregation murmured against the rulers. But the rulers said to the congregation, we have sworn by the Lord our God of Israel. Now, therefore, we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Okay, they're going to make them serve as servants. They're going to make them do this. But, you know, we've made the deal. And we've agreed to do this. Now, you see here, the next thing that happens in chapter 10, Not everybody among the Canaanites and the associated peoples were happy when they heard the Gibeonites had made this deal with the Israelites. In verse 1, it came to pass when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and his king, and so had done to Ai and to its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, they feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all of his men were mighty. These people were just astute. They decided that as strong and tough as they were, they decided from listening to all the stories, they wanted to get on the right side of history. And Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hamath, king of Hebron, and to Piram, king of Jarmuth, and to all these other guys, saying, hey, come up with me and help me so that we may strike Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and the children of Israel, and said, we're going to deal with our own so that nobody falls out of rank. And you know, they were going to, their effort was they were going to wipe them out as an example. So for, you know, so that anybody else would be afraid to make a deal with the Israelites because they were going to fight. But you see here in verse 6, Joshua chapter 10 and verse 6, and the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua unto the camp at Gilgal, saying, do not withhold your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us, and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered against us. You know, maybe God uses this as an opportunity. You know, assemble my enemies, make it a little bit easier to get to them. And Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of war, and they fought. And they beat them. This is a rather famous account. Now, they had made a pledge to the Gibeonites, and Joshua, you know, was called to honor it immediately. You know, God, when you make a pledge in the name of the Lord, you are bound to keep it. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 21, 2 Samuel chapter 21, 2 Samuel chapter 21. And verse 1. I'm going to read this in the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Now, during David's reign, so this is King David, it's about 1000 AD, so we're dealing with about 400 some odd years later, okay? During David's reign, there was a famine for 3 successive years. Okay, there's climate change. Climate change for 3 bad years, okay? The harvest just wasn't coming in. They weren't getting the rain, so they weren't getting the grain to mature or grow. So David inquired of the Lord. See, they didn't just assume bad weather was because they were producing too much carbon dioxide. I'm sorry, I have to make a point. So David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered. Now, listen to this. The Lord answered, it is because of the blood shed by Saul and his family when he killed the Gibeonites. So here was this Canaanite, Hivite people who were originally supposed to be annihilated, but Joshua and the elders had fallen for their ruse. Okay, they had followed, these guys were smart, they had fallen for the ruse, and they had made an oath, they had made a treaty with them. And God was saying that 400 years later, that this man Saul and his family had killed the Gibeonites, breaking the treaty. God was making them hold to the treaty, to the Canaanite people. And the Gibeonites, verse 2, 2 Samuel 21, verse 2. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but rather a remnant of the Amorites, people dwelling in ancient Canaan, and the Israelites had taken an oath concerning them, but Saul had tried to kill them in his zeal for the Israelites and Judah. So David summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them, and he asked the Gibeonites, what should I do for you? How shall I make atonement so that you will bring a blessing on the Lord's inheritance? And the Gibeonites said to him, we are not asking for money from Saul or his family. Now, they were actually quoting Scripture when they did this. You know, they knew the Scriptures by this time. Interesting. The Gibeonites knew something of Israel. They were paying attention and learning. Because you go to Numbers 35 and verse 32, it says, "You are not to accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of killing someone. He must be put to death." So they knew the law, which was interesting. Here are the Gibeonite people, one of the ancient pagan peoples of Canaan, and they had learned from living among the Israelites the nature of the law, of what God's judgments were in this case. In verse, let's go back, continue back to 2 Samuel 21 and verse 4. "And we cannot put anyone to death in Israel." Of course not. They were a subject people. "And whatever you say, I will do for you." Okay, David said. And they replied to the king, "As for the man who annihilated us and plotted to destroy us, so that we would not exist within the whole territory of Israel, let 7 of his male descendants be handed over to us, that we may hang them in the presence of the Lord at Gibeah of Saul," which is where, Saul's family home was. "The Lord's chosen." The king answered, "I will hand them over," and he did, and they did. God expected, he had caused the famine because he expected them to keep the word to this Canaanite people, and not to kill them, not to annihilate them, not to wipe them out. Now, what is the other evidence? When you go to Joshua, let's go to Joshua 11. Let's go on here, back to Joshua chapter 11. Again, the geneticist paper said, well, the Bible says they were all annihilated. Well, there was a certain amount of annihilation, but it's not quite the way we think. But in Joshua chapter 11, "And it came to pass that Jabin, king of Hazor, had heard about these things, and he too assembled a confederacy to fight against Israel." But we see in verse 6 here of Joshua 11, "And the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time I will deliver them up, and all killed before Israel, and you will hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." And Joshua came suddenly, and all the people of war with him, against them by the waters of Merom, and they fell upon them. And he killed this Jabin, king of Hazor. And then he says, verse 10, "And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and struck its king with the sword. And Hazor formerly was the head of all those kingdoms, and they struck every soul in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them, and left none breathing. And he burned Hazor with fire. And he took the cities of the kings that were allied with that king of Hazor and annihilated them." So what do we see? Of course, this has been a controversial point. There are a lot of people who think the Bible is not true. The Bible doesn't give a true witness, or is not, doesn't have any sort of historicity. We can't depend on its word. But what does it say? There was an interesting article by the Biblical Archaeological Society, Hazor excavation. Amnon Ben Tor reveals who conquered biblical Canaanites. I just happen to personally have met Amnon Ben Tor a number of times when I was studying over at the Hebrew University. But it says this article: "But did the Israelites really destroy Canaanite Hazor? Many archaeologists have called into question the book of Joshua's account of the Israelites' conquest of the biblical Canaanites, saying it's not supported or is contradicted in some cases by the evidence on the ground. Early Hazor excavations led by the late Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin in the 1950s and 1960s set out to explore this question. And Yadin's findings seem to support the theory that the Israelite settlement followed the biblical Canaanites at Hazor, and the excavations left many questions about the Canaanite city's destruction unanswered. However, enter Amnon Ben Tor, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who has directed the Renew Hazor's excavation since 1990. When I met him, he was just beginning his excavations. In 25 seasons, the renewed excavations have uncovered more of the Hazor Acropolis. The Acropolis is the area where the king and the royal family and his nobles would live, the upper part of the city, which boasted temples, palaces, and other public buildings, as well as parts of the lower city where the commoners lived. Their findings reveal much about the destruction of biblical Canaanites Hazor. The largest structures revealed in the recent Hazor excavations, the ceremonial palace in the middle of the Acropolis. In the ruins of the palace, Ben Tor and his team have discovered many rich finds, including bronze statues, ivory, jewelry, seals, and even a lion-headed rhyton, a drinking vessel, that all point to the wealth of the Canaanite rulers. They also uncovered evidence of a massive fire that destroyed the ceremonial palace and much of Canaanite Hatzor, a blaze that would have been memorable for its intensity. Relying on these finds and much more, Amnon Ben-Tor convincingly concludes that it was indeed the Israelites who conquered the biblical Canaanites' city of Hatzor. Oftentimes, some of the disagreements that will occur is because people they disagree on chronology. If you try to misplace things by 200 years, you don't come up with the same evidence. So it does make a difference. But did that mean the evidence that they have? Jericho was destroyed. I've seen the walls. Hatzor was destroyed. The discussion is that the Canaanites that were there, the Bible says, they were annihilated. And yet this genetic report says we have all this evidence of the continuity of the legacy of the Canaanites. People still have their DNA. What was the Bible saying? Did the authors of this genetic report, did they get the point wrong? They only got part of the point. Fake news. Let's go to Joshua chapter 13. You know, sometimes when people make their conclusions, they don't bother reading the rest of the book. They don't bother going very much deeply into the Bible to see what it says because they have such a bad attitude towards it. They're looking for what they want to try to prove their point, and while they ignore the rest. Joshua 13 and verse 1, Holman Christian Standard Bible, says, 13 verse 1, now Joshua was now old, getting on in years, and the Lord said to him, you've become old, getting on in years. I guess God's made it, he's, Mr. Captain Obvious. But a great deal of the land remains to be possessed. This is the land that remains, all the district of the Philistines, and it gives you this whole listing of all these things. And it says in verse 6, and all the inhabitants of the country from Lebanon to Misrephoth Maim, and all the Sidonians, all this area that we now call Lebanon. All these people were unconquered. They were still there at the time of when Joshua was getting old. The Lord said to him, you're old. So what do we see? Joshua dies. You have this great, they come in, they divide the land, they wipe out a number of cities, but are the Canaanites annihilated? We see here in Judges, you go to the next book, in Judges chapter 1 and verse 1. And it came to pass after the death of Joshua, the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up, for I have delivered the land into his hand. You can read the account, and Judah goes, and they go up, verse 4, and Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they killed 10,000 of them in Bezek. And it goes on to get account. Yes, so some of them continued to do this. You see this. But then you go down here in verse 8, and the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem and had taken it, and had struck it with the edge of the sword, and had set the city on fire. They took at that point in time Jerusalem, but they weren't going to be able to hold it, as it turns out, because we know by the time of David that the Jebusites were there. And it says, verse 9, and afterward the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country and in the south and in the valley. And it goes on to go some more. They had a variety of success, and Caleb, who was Joshua's second in command, they take Hebron, and he gives it to his daughter and the man who would attack it. And you find that they do this. And then we have so we have the capture of these other places, which makes for an interesting reading. But we see here in verse 19, let's go to verse 19, Judges 1 and verse 19. It says, and the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the mountains. See what the second half of the comment is. But he could not drive out those who lived in the valley because they had chariots of iron. See, which were the tanks of that day. Yeah, they had the hill country, but they didn't get the flat land, the lowlands. They weren't able to do that. Now you see here, let's go down to verse 22. Now the house of Joseph, not the Judahites, but the house of Joseph, who lived farther north, what we'd call much of the West Bank these days, also went up against Bethel. The Lord was with them. And it talks about how they had success at this one place. And then it talks about, however, you see here in verse 29, go down to 29, and Ephraim did not expel the Canaanites who lived at Gezer, but the Canaanites lived in the land of Gezer among them. And you go down here to verse 27, and it says, it points out, Manasseh had not taken possession of Bethshan and its villages, nor Tanakh and its villages, nor struck at the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, nor the inhabitants of Iblaim and its villages, nor the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites were determined to live in the land. And it came to pass when Israel became strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor and did not completely expel them. They didn't. They didn't completely expel them. You go through, read through the account here in this chapter, and you see that they continued to stay there. Verse 32, and the Asherites lived among the Canaanites who lived in the land, and for they did not expel them. And Naphtali did not expel those who lived at Beth Shemesh, and the inhabitants of Beth Anath, and they lived among the Canaanites. This was a problem. This was going to be a problem. Let's go to verse 2. Verse 2. Chapter 2 of Judges. Judges chapter 2. And the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you go up out of Egypt and have brought you to the land that I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no treaty with those who live in this land, and you shall throw down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this that you have done? And I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. And it came to pass when the angel of the Lord had spoken these words to all the children of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called the name of the place of weeping, Bochim. In verse 22, let's go down to verse 22. Well, verse 20. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not obeyed my voice, also from now on I will not expel from before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, and so that by them I may prove Israel whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord, to go in it as their fathers did, or not. And the Lord left those nations without driving them out quickly, and he did not deliver them into the hand of Joshua. And obviously you can see there, the elders, some of the elders who lived out overlived him. They didn't do it. The Canaanites weren't annihilated. It says the Bible is very specific about that. For the authors of this report on this latest genetic research to have come to that conclusion without bothering to pay a little more attention to the Bible, it's truly fake news. It's truly fake news. If we go to Jeremiah 19, the fact that the Israelites didn't annihilate the Canaanites, didn't do what they were told, was going to come back on them. And it would prove to be, as what God said, a snare to them. Even at the very end, because Jeremiah, here we're talking in the 500s, we're talking more than 800 years after the events we just related there in Judges. We find this. Jeremiah chapter 19 and verse 1. Thus says the Lord, go and get a potter's earthen jar. Okay. Yeah. Get a clay jug from a potter. Take some of the elders of the people and the priests and go out to the valley of Ben Hinnom in the front of the potsherd gate. There speak the words I tell you. Say, kings of Judah and people of Jerusalem, listen to this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord all-powerful, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel says, I will soon bring disaster, evil, trouble upon this place, all of Judah and Jerusalem, that will amaze and frighten everyone who hears about it. Verse 4, they, that is all you people who had made a covenant with me, to promise to obey me, they have quit following me. They've abandoned me. They've forsaken me. Their leadership had abandoned God. They had forsaken God. Very much like most of our leadership in the Western world has turned their back on Judeo-Christian ethics and morality. That made these countries what we are. That made us great here in Canada and the United States and Britain. They have quit following me. They've abandoned me. They've forsaken me. They've turned their backs on me. And he goes on, they have made this place for foreign gods. All these, the worshiping all this other stuff. Idolatry is whatever you put before the true God, the God of the Bible. And our society has put all sorts of stuff before the God of the Bible. And God eventually planned, he told them he's going to punish them for it. He was going to punish them for it. Let's go to Ezekiel, different prophet, Ezekiel chapter 16. Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 1. Ezekiel 16 and verse 1. I'm going to read this from the New Living Translation. Then another message came to me from the Lord. Son of man, confront Jerusalem with her detestable sins. Give her this message from the sovereign Lord. You are nothing but a Canaanite. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. Okay, he's abusing them. He's taking out a case. So you're nothing but a Canaanite. And then he proceeds to tell them how he's going to punish them. Because they have turned their backs on him. They have rebelled. The leaders had done this. They knew better, but they did it because that was what was convenient. That's what they wanted to do. And yet, in spite of all that, God says, well, they might have turned their backs on my covenant, but I haven't. Ezekiel 16 and verse 59. Yes, thus says the Lord, I will also deal with you as you have done. Okay, we reap what we sow. We reap what we sow. You who have despised my oath by breaking the covenant. Okay, I'm gonna pay you back for this. But verse 60, nevertheless, I will remember with compassion my covenant with you in the days of your youth. The days when, Joshua was coming into the land. And I will establish an everlasting covenant with you. Then you will remember your ways and be ashamed when you receive your sisters, both the older and your younger. I will give them to you as daughters, but you will, but not because of your covenant with me. And I will establish my covenant with you, and you will know without any doubt, the way the Amplified emphasize it, that I am the Lord. Verse 63, so that you may remember in detail and be shamed and never open your mouth again because of your humiliation when I have forgiven you for all you have done. See, God's going to use the opportunity. He did all the way to the very end of the last of the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah, when he led them into captivity to punish them because they had forsaken him and hadn't followed his covenant, well, he said that wasn't the end of the story, however. It wasn't going to be the end of the story. But let's go to Psalms. Let's take a look at something here. Let's go in the book of Psalms. Psalms 106. God sort of sums it up here at this point. Psalms 106, and let's start at verse 34. He said, Psalm 106 and verse 34. They did not destroy the nations, the Canaanites, as the Lord had commanded them, but mingled themselves among the nations and learned their works. Is it a surprise that the Canaanite DNA survived to the present day? And they served their idols, which were a snare to them. Yea, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons and shed innocent blood, even the blood of their sons and their daughters. Okay, child sacrifice. Ancient world's version of abortion, which we do in much greater numbers. Whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was defiled with blood, and they were defiled with their works and went a-whoring after their own inventions. Therefore the wrath of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he abhorred his inheritance. And he gave them into the hand of the nations, and those who hated them ruled over them. And their enemies oppressed them, and they were brought into subjection under their hands. Many times he delivered them, but they were rebellious in their counsel, and were brought low for their iniquities. Nevertheless, he looked upon their affliction, and he heard their cry, and he remembered his covenant for them, and repented according to the multitude of his mercies. And he made them also to be pitied by all those who carried them captives. Verse 47, Save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from among the nations. Give thanks to your holy name, and triumph in your praise. Of course, the modern nation of Israel was founded in 1948. It's a remarkable thing. After being not a nation for almost 1900 years, God brought back these direct descendants whose DNA corresponds to the ancient people of Israel. He brought them back to fulfill his promise. But the Canaanites weren't wiped out. It says very clearly they didn't do what they were originally told to do. And because of that, we should expect that the Canaanite DNA would still be found today among the descendants. And why should we be surprised if we find it in Lebanon, which was part of the Canaanite homeland? And even the geneticists have to admit, it's remarkably little changed. Now, what is the origin of the fake news that the aggressive secular media uses in its long campaign to try to discredit faith in the Judeo-Christian scriptures? Where does inspiration come from? Because I take it these geneticists at the Sanger Institute are smart cookies. The fact that they could not perceive and look a little farther in the Bible to see that what they were publishing and promoting all over the place is one of the major premises for their findings was the Bible is not, historic. It's not what. I mean, they look like jerks. They really did. Who has the possibility to turn these guys into a laughingstock? Let's go to John 8:44. John 8:44. Jesus was saying this to those who had a campaign to try to discredit the Word of God, the plan of God. He said this, You are of your father, the devil, and it is your will to practice the desires which are characteristic of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks what is natural to him, for he is a liar and the father of lies and half-truths. That's the way the Amplified renders that verse. Lies and half-truths. The real story the real story about the survival of the ancient Canaanite DNA means, you know, the scientists don't get it, the Sanger Institute. The journalists who so breathlessly reported that this latest evidence discredits the Bible, it's fake news. Complete fake news. Let's go to Matthew 10. Matthew chapter 10 in the New Covenant Scriptures. Matthew 10 and start with verse 1. I'm going to read this in the King James Version. Matthew 10 and verse 1. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, this is Jesus, he gave them power against unclean spirits, to cast them out, to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Now the name of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Thomas, and Matthew the publican, James the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, and Simon the Canaanite. You know, there's a lot of speculation of why he was called Simon the Canaanite. Who knows, you know? I mean, you know, the Bible does call people are what they are. You know, John and James were called the sons of thunder because at one point in time they, let's call down fire on these Samaritans because they wouldn't let us, you know, buy food there or stay there overnight. Verse 5, these 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles and into any of the city of the Samaritans, some of these pagan people from the Middle East who were resettled in that part of what we now know as the West Bank. The Samaritans are still there, by the way. Enter ye not, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And when you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. As Apostle Peter would later say, repent and believe the gospel and act on it. Let's go to Matthew 15 while we're here in Matthew. Matthew chapter 15. And I'm going to read this in verse 21. I'm going to read this in the Amplified Bible version. Breaking into the middle of this chapter. And after leaving there, Jesus withdrew. He just had a big conflict with some of his detractors. Jesus withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Modern Lebanon. Ancient part of the Phoenician Empire. By the way, the Phoenicians and the Israelites had had a covenant of brotherly friendship for quite a while, and you see when you read through Scripture, there was a certain amount of intermarriage, and they did stuff together, with Solomon. You see this. Remember, 90% of the people in Lebanon, of their genetic heritage, is Canaanite. 10% was from these other Eurasian steppe people. Anyways, this going on, that Tyre and Sidon were some 35 miles, or 35, Tyre was 35 miles, Sidon was 60 miles north of Galilee. Anyways, verse 22. So Jesus is withdrawn to this district of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman, verse 22, from the district came out and began to cry out urgently, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David, Messiah. New Covenant Scriptures were clear that they're Canaanites' descendants. The fellows who were writing that Sanger Institute genetic research paper didn't look at the New Covenant Scriptures either. And a Canaanite woman from the district came out and began to cry urgently, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. That is the Messiah. My daughter is cruelly possessed by a demon. She's got a real mental health problem, we would say these days. But he did not say a word in answer to her. And his disciples came and asked him repeatedly, send her away, because she keeps shouting out after us. I mean, she was following them, and they're trying to hang out in this, up there in this, this Gentile area, and she's out there shouting out, publicity they didn't really want. Jesus answered, he said to his disciples, I was commissioned by God and sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and began to kneel down before him, saying, Lord, help me. Verse 26, and he replied, it is not good. It is not appropriate. It is not fair to take the children's bread, the children of Israel's bread, and throw it to the pet dogs. That's the way the Amplified translates this. Now, the Jews commonly use the Greek word kuon, or dog, as a derogatory term to refer to Gentiles. A kuon was seen as a despised, filthy, homeless street scavenger. However, when speaking with this Canaanite woman, Jesus uses the Greek word kunarion. That refers to a household pet. Kunarion. The use of the word of this kunarion by both Jesus and the woman, as we'll see it here in just a minute, reflects a sort of tenderness, a spiritual sensitivity, a familiarity perhaps of a long historical background in this exchange between this Canaanite woman and Jesus. Let's go to verse 27 now here in Matthew. So let's read the next one here in Matthew 15, verse 27. And the Canaanite woman said, yes, Lord, it's not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the pet dogs. But she said that she answers Jesus. She says, yes, Lord, but even the pet dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their young masters' tables. And Jesus answered her, woman, your faith, your personal trust and confidence in my power is great. It will be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at that moment. This exchange, of course, foreshadows that the Gentile believers, even Canaanites, would not be spiritually homeless, but would be welcomed into God's household as his children. And that's the response. That's the nature of the response that Jesus gave to this Canaanite woman. The real news from this latest genetic research that the modern-day descendants of the ancient Canaanites, that they're still around and alive, proves, in many ways that the biblical witness is true rather than the opposite. The Bible clearly points out that the Canaanites were not annihilated by the Israelites because they didn't do their job. And God used them instead to test Israel. But in the course of that testing, a variety of them decided, we're on the wrong side of history. Just like the Gibeonites, we're going to get on the right side of history. And this woman up in Lebanon, this Canaanite woman, said, there's real power here. Our neighbors have got this right. Heal my daughter, Lord. This latest genetic research, 100 degrees opposite from what, what the editors were trying to purport it to make it, what it means, actually proves that the biblical witness is true. It does the opposite of what they contend. And that's certainly good news for all the modern-day descendants of the Canaanites.